Just start the recording. Welcome everyone to our new session in our webinar series, Using Social Media as a Research Tool. We are very pleased to have Simon Munze today here with us. Simon is a professor of data science and public policy at the Hertie School in Berlin and is also the director of the Data Science Lab. His research focuses on political communication, attitude formation in the digital age, and in his work, Simon has extensively used social media, and I think is using this talk to kind of do a bit of a reflection of some of the work he's done last year in the German federal election. As always, Simon will first give his input lecture. If you have questions, please feel free to just put them in the Q&A. If there's something that is about clarification, I will just disrupt Simon to clarify so that we don't get lost. Otherwise, we will have time at the end for a proper questions and discussion on the topic. Without further ado, Simon, over to you then.
Thanks so much, Anja, for the kind introduction, and hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. This is a great opportunity for me to give back. I have done a couple of projects using social media data, and from the start, we've profited a lot from what you, Anja, and your team have done for the community to learn how this is actually done. The project that I'm going to present is quite ad hoc, I have to say. So it's not a fully fledged paper, and it's certainly not as meticulously done as much of your work has been to learn about how we should do that stuff. But I hope it's still interesting and would spark a discussion on how we should think about geography when we think about recruiting people into surveys via social media. So this is a project that I've been working together jointly with a couple of folks. All you see here on the slide, we are all part of a project called Zweitstimme.org. That's a German name because it's a German project with German data, and unfortunately all German folks on the team. But we are at least diverse in terms of geography. We're based at 3 different universities in Germany. So what I want to talk about is geography and representativeness, and both, I guess. So when we think about recruiting people, not only from social media, but through all different kinds of means, we think about representativeness in along various dimensions, right? Like what we usually benchmark our data against is standard demographics, age, gender, education, and report to what extent we match them in our data. So you see here from the seminal Neun of Öztürk paper, where you compared the sample across different age and gender categories. And usually there is not a perfect match, right? Because we do convenience sampling. When you recruit via social media, you would usually maybe over or underrepresent certain age groups. That might depend on platform, that might depend on how you reach out, but that usually happens. Education is, I think, a fairly robust finding that you have higher educated overrepresented in your sample. Gender is often less of a problem, but also maybe not a perfect match. What can you do about that? Various strategies, first diagnose the problem and then try to adjust for it using benchmark data. So we can try and stratify or rake depending on the granularity of the, say, ground truth data that we have. That might or might not work. The underlying problem is, of course, that demographics are fairly straightforward to benchmark against because we have, say, official stats for that. But it's usually not what you're interested in. You're interested in downstream attitudes and all kinds of latent behaviors and attitudes that are or are not strongly correlated with those factors. So that might or might not help. Now, What we think about is an additional factor that you might want to care about when you think about representativeness, and that is geography. So why would you care about that? A couple of points here. First, many social phenomena are inherently geographic, right? Like we have observed over decades divides along urban and rural cleavages. We see effects of like the political environment that is highly local, also local media effects. Outcomes of elections are a good case, right? We see that they vary across districts, and there is geographic clustering involved. When you look at like into more classic studies of how information travels, space matters a lot. I'm a political scientist, so I care about political processes, and they are heavily structured by geography. So when you look at the German case, what you see in the right is like just a few examples looping through, where the East-West divide is extremely visible on a whole lot of outcomes. So that is like political outcomes, but also economic outcomes, social outcomes, all that. Electoral systems might actually amplify the role that geography plays because local representation can boost the idiosyncrasy of like how people think about parties, politicians, and the like. So bottom line is substantively, you just might care about geography. Geography might matter for the relationships that you're interested in. There is a more technical reason to care about geography. Now, if geography matters for your outcome and you don't achieve, say, like geographic balance, that is a sample that, say, covers all regions or whatever geographic units you're interested in equally, you might have a problem. And the problem is that demographics that you would be used to like correct for, adjust for, that might not be enough, right? So like I try to like illustrate that with the DAG below. So like some of the factors that contribute to differences in outcomes with regards to geography might travel through demographic factors, age, gender, education, or other factors you care about or measure, but certainly not all of them. And if you say don't account for that, there could be like a persistent effect on your outcomes that you don't capture for. Again, this is a very technical approach. You might care for say like this like geographic variation like for the reason I just mentioned, but maybe you don't, but then you still would want to care about say like imbalance in geography because that might affect your findings. For instance, if you heavily oversample say like a certain region in your country or subregions, like classically urban over rural districts, for instance, that might affect your findings as soon as your outcomes of interest are correlated with those units. I would argue that that maybe matters to a different extent for different, say, setups. So if you are running experiments, that might matter less. If you are interested in mere description or prediction, that might matter more. But I wouldn't say that like for any goal that you have, that is completely irrelevant. And I think it just is, and you would want to care about. Now there is another maybe more positive spin to that. So if you achieve, say, geographic balance, that is, you recruit a sample that is not just sampled from one, say, like substate or a geographic subunit, but like covers basically the entire population that you're interested in, that might help you capture other factors that you don't directly adjust for. And why is that? We know that a lot of social processes are driven by geography. So think migration, think settlement, think economy, think social composition. And if your sample, well, covers geography or geographic units widely, you would expect to also, as a consequence of that, get good variation on those unmeasured factors just by accident or like as a positive result, right? So put differently, if you condition on geography, you might capture unmeasured factors that yeah might confound your relationships that you're interested in, but like that should actually help. Um, yeah, I think like the stuff on the right is a point I basically made. Again, like if you're substantively interested in, say, like how phenomena vary over space, you should care about like whether you're able to measure across space. That's basically the point. Okay. Now, back to survey recruitment. In classic survey research, recruitment that is to some extent determined by geography is not new, right? When you think about face-to-face surveys or copy surveys, um, geographic clustering has been a key design feature just to reduce fieldwork cost. If you have a set of interviewers traveling around, you would want to minimize travel costs and like fieldwork costs by just clustering observations geographically. So that's a key feature in most of those designs that you have primary sampling units. Those could be municipalities or like certain regions, and within those regions, you would then start to like try and recruit respondents. Often like in a multi-stage setup, that is, you have households and then individuals within households and so on. So that is a cost-saving strategy, but it also creates costs because if the things that you care about cluster geographically, that means you have a more homogeneous sample that you would wish for, right? So the effective N goes down when you have those clustering designs. And that is what, say, like those high quality social science surveys account for when they give you weights, when they give you instructions of how to deal with that kind of design. That is not to ignore it, but to account for it. So, German General Social Survey does it, European Social Survey does it, British Household Panel Survey, and the German equivalent, they do it, right? Now, that is fundamentally different from how you would recruit online or via social media, right? With all the problems that come with convenience sampling, we don't necessarily face costs that, like those, say, like face-to-face surveys run into when they do recruitment. Geographic coverage basically is a function of platform penetration, platform use, and how you target. But it's not a fundamental feature of your sampling frame. Maybe with the exception of saying, well, if you want to run a survey in country X, well, that would be a location decision that you make. But within that unit, you're basically free to recruit. So no additional costs for like a geographically sophisticated scheme, or like for ignoring geography altogether and just say, like, well, give me any respondents. Like, let's just launch this ad in Germany and see what happens. So that is what I want to look into. I focus on a couple of questions, on some of them with more detail and some of them less. But the first would be how can we do that in practice? How can we recruit geographically on social media? What like options do the different platforms offer? Second, how do we measure geographic representativeness? What does it mean? At which geographic level should we do that? Are there trade-offs? Yes, there are. And then a little bit more analytically, what predicts geographic coverage? So is it easier or more difficult in certain regions to recruit online? And fourth, well, I'll not really talk about that because like I don't have a lot of evidence on that, but should we care in terms of does it matter for our outcomes, for our results, right? If you have a geographic imbalance, how would that translate into into meaningful bias, for instance, in your findings. Okay, so um, let me briefly talk about geographically targeted recruitment on social media. And full disclaimer, I haven't done most of that. So the only surveys that I ran were via Meta, so Facebook and Instagram. I haven't run my own surveys on YouTube, but TikTok or X. That being said, those platforms all have their documentations for, say, like how to run ads, right? So that tells us something about like what they offer in terms of location functionality. I'll say a little bit more about Facebook and Instagram in a second, but like here's just a quick overview for all those platforms. In principle, you can do geographic targeting on all of them, and theoretically, the differences are not that big in the sense that you can target multiple different geographic layers in all of them. So this could be, well, what everybody of us has done is as long as you've recruited people from social media, you can target specific countries, you can target states or provinces within country, you can go down to the city level, even down to the zip code level, even down, that varies a little bit by platform, but even down to the address level and set a radius and say like around this, say like a geolocation, I want to basically broadcast my ad. Whether you can do the radius varies a little bit by location type and also by context, but yeah, in principle you can do it. Um, YouTube, well, that's Google. They are well, they are the kings of online-based advertisements, so they offer you a lot. Yeah, didn't certainly fit on my slide, but yeah, check out the full table of like all the location types and levels. It's pretty stunning what you can do there. Obviously, when you advertise on YouTube, you're doing say like video-based recruitment that creates other challenges, but in principle, that's possible. uh, TikTok as well. So many location levels from country to zip code. And I noted that down here for TikTok, but that is not too different from the other platforms. You can target multiple locations at the same time per ad group. So that is a thing, right? And on X, I'm not sure whether anybody still does X, but that also works. A bit more background on Meta's geographic targeting in practice. So, targeting, as most of you might know, is set at the ad set level, and at this level, you can target one or more geographic units. What Meta allows you to do is to target different location types. So this could be you could be interested in like targeting people who live there. I think that would be the default for us. Versus recently there, I'm like commuting or traveling. Versus traveling only. I'm like for some businesses that is attractive, right? Like targeting the tourists. So that is one option. And within the unit that you target, you get reach estimates. I haven't evaluated them systematically, but that yeah would tell you something about like how much feedback you can expect. Now, something that you can do, something that we in the project that I'm going to tell you about in a couple of minutes have not done, but what you can do is just like a bulk creation of ad sets, and that makes a lot of sense as soon as you target more than just a handful of locations. So think targeting at the zip code level. You wouldn't want to set up like hundreds of those locations manually, and you don't have to. You can just basically bulk create them. A couple of caveats. I'm like, just as we have to work with some assumptions when we say like try to like geolocate our respondents, those platforms have to make an educated guess about like where their users are located. Like they have much more data available than just the IP address, obviously, but If it were just driven by the IP address, you have to be aware that that is not necessarily the actual location, right? Think of users living border areas, VPN users, travelers that, yeah, might add some noise there. So that is one thing to think about. I'll get back to that in the context of the survey. Second is that some areas might just be more costly than others, more competitive for recruitment. Yeah, something to consider when you set up your budget and yeah, face the trade-off of yeah, survey costs versus good geographic coverage. All right. So much for the theory. What I would like to do now is walk you through a survey project that we conducted last year. And yeah, it was quite an extensive project, as you will see. But again, like my main focus will be on like how I think about geography, geographic balance in that context, and what we can learn from that. Again, just to set the expectations, we did not run this study to learn systematically about geographic recruitment or say like social media ad-based recruitment more generally. Say like we didn't run any experiments on that front, and I think you should do that if you actually want to learn much more about like how that works. So yeah, treat everything I now tell you with a grain of salt. But I think some of the descriptors are still quite interesting and actually quite encouraging when it comes to yeah, geographic targeting. Okay, just a few words on the project. So we are a team of election scientists or election forecasters with a focus on multi-party elections, and even more specifically with a focus on the German federal election. And our main motivation is to, well, forecast the outcome of the election at the national level, but also at the district level. Learn about, say, like the potential of new ways of forecasting, or newer, it's not new, it's not that we invented it, but of the potential of citizen forecasting at the district level. And as a third stream within the project, learn more about like how polls and forecasts can be communicated more effectively when you think about positive downstream effects of, well, of that kind of information in an election context, right? Like what do people learn from polls, from forecasts? Are there negative consequences and the like? So that was the area of our project where we ran a lot of experiments. Yeah, not going to report on that today, but yeah, that was another important component of the project. So, what we did was to collect a lot of data for the first time. So, like, we had run this project since 2017. That was our first election. We, in the past couple of elections, worked with published polling data and basically then modeled them together with other structural data. Last year, for the first time, we collected our own data because we had to for, in particular, the citizen forecasting at the district level and our experiments. We chose two modes of recruitment. The first one was, say, like the more classic online access panel approach. We basically bought into Belendi's online access panel. And the second one was via social media ads. We did that for two reasons. A, because, well, we had a solid budget and could just like try and experiment with stuff. B, I'm like, we were really dependent on good geographic coverage, right? When you do district level election forecasting, ideally you get information at the district level. And whether that would be available like through Belendi, through the online access panel, was not clear a priori. So our agreement with them was we don't do strict quotas. We do soft targets in terms of, let's say, like gender and age, but we aim for a certain number of respondents per electoral district. So in the German context, you have roughly 300 districts, electoral districts, and we wanted to have at least 20 respondents per district. And they were not too happy when we asked them because like they didn't do that kind of analysis before with or like that kind of project before with their data, and they had just like limited experience whether like recruitment at that low geographic resolution would work. So in addition, we did social media recruitment again via Facebook and Instagram. We set up 64 ad sets, which is the result of a targeting that combines the geographic component. This is state at the state level, so the 16 German states times two age groups, young and old, times gender, male and female. We allocated budgets proportionally to basically the size of the states, right? So we had information about like the state level eligible voter counts and allocated budget accordingly. Now, geolocation of respondents is obviously like a key component of the survey, and we had like different strategies to basically pin respondents down. The first is just the targeting by state or Bundesland, right? So you do that within Facebook, but we also did it in the survey. So we basically asked people which is the state that you live in. And then we did a drill down because like what we needed to know is which electoral district they are located in. Many people don't know their name of their district, and like some have really weird names. So this would be, I don't know, Mannheim 2. Well, who knows whether they live in Mannheim 1 or 2 or so. So, but like our assumption was like what everybody knows is their zip code, and zip codes don't match one-on-one on districts. So some zip code areas are split, but you can basically take it from there. So you ask respondents, "What's your zip code?" And if it was ambiguous in terms of like what district like corresponds to that, we would do a follow up with a lower level administrative unit up until the level where there is no uncertainty anymore. So that gave us like the zip code information, the state level information, and their self-reported electoral district or Wahlkreis. Plus, that is something that like Qualtrics as our survey software tracked for us automatically, an IP-based geolocation. So that is basically done automatically through their servers. So the user agent of a participant sends them their IP address, and they basically use a geolocation service to basically resolve that to latitude and longitudinal value, which we can then again map onto our districts and see whether a respondent would be located within a district or not. Okay. Um, just some descriptive stats. To what extent did we meet population benchmarks? So by means of like age, group, gender, and education. And you see that like on some of those categories, like we missed the benchmark by quite a bit. So interestingly, for both the Access panel and for the social media ads, we have problems getting the youngest. But on the other hand, this is not TikTok. This is Facebook and yes, Instagram. But yeah, that might explain some of that. The most obvious discrepancy is education, right? So it's super difficult in both modes, actually, but even more so with our social media ads strategy to get people with low levels of formal education in the sample, right? Like we have a massive overrepresentation of the highly educated, and that potentially has consequences. So that's the, say, like the standard benchmarking. This is an election or pre-election survey, so you should probably also care about how political preferences are represented. So this is a comparison between like the vote intention of people that they articulated in our survey versus the actual share, vote share at the election. And you see massive, massive differences here. To some extent in the Access panel already, but like very much so in the social media sample. We heavily over-recruited people from the Greens, from the left, You might say, well, those are like the people who are more more the onliner population, right? AfD voters as well, and say like the two, well, former big parties, you have to say, the conservatives, the CSU, CDU, CSU, and the Social Democrats, the SPD, are heavily underrepresented in our sample, which is potentially bad news when you care about preferences, but that was not so much of a problem for us in principle because like we care about expectations more than intentions. But yeah, I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Now, the reason for like we're here and discussing this topic. So, what about geographic representativeness? Before I give you some evidence from our survey, one step back. What could geographic representativeness even mean? So I talked a bit about countries and states and like that we targeted by those units. But that's probably not what you ultimately care about. So, what you could care about is coverage as a metric. So, say you are interested in a certain geographic level unit. In our case, that was the electoral districts, but that could be anything else. So, one question you might ask is which of those geographic units have any respondents or which have enough by any standard? And you could capture that with a coverage rate. So, like, what is the share of units with at least, say, one, two, five, whatever respondents? I would say that is a pretty basic metric, but it's not entirely useless. One that I will give you some evidence on for our study. Second component or second, say, like aspect of representativeness could be concentration. To what extent is recruitment maybe geographically clustered, or to what extent is like are the units, the geographic units represented proportionally to their size or population shares? That would be like I think like a fairly common thing to care about. So we could operationalize that, for instance, by looking at the coverage ratio. So what is the number of respondents in a certain unit with respect to the population share, and are we say like over or underrepresenting that unit by that metric? And well, that gives you a unit-specific metric. You can also look at the overall structure, right? Is there like a systematic geographic clustering of imbalance or of recruitment, right? So those are three pretty pragmatic metrics. The problem is that those might not be the metrics you care about. And that has something to do with what, say, like political geographers or geographers more generally, or people working, for instance, on political conflict, are too familiar with. That is the modifiable areal unit problem. Um, that means that your findings might heavily depend on where you set the borders, right? Like how you define geography. In that context, I would say geographic representativeness is totally scale dependent, right? So, as a simple example, when you zoom in, that is when your geographic unit shrinks, it becomes more and more difficult, for instance, to satisfy good coverage because like some districts might not be covered at all. Say when you have 300 districts and you have 1,000 respondents, you can imagine that it will be super hard to like have at least one respondent in every district. Other geographic features might be masked by the higher level that you care about. For instance, you can achieve perfect balance on all districts, but you might still overrepresent people living in urban spaces compared to rural spaces, right? And depending on like what you measure, you might not even be able to capture that directly or indirectly. So yeah, not saying that I have solutions to all those questions, but I think like geographic representativeness is something that is not necessarily straightforward to think about. And obviously, when you think about demographic representation, you can also combine both, and then things become even more complicated. Okay, back to the data. So, like one key feature of our setup was, of course, that we had a lot of respondents. I think I say didn't say that explicitly, but we were talking about a sample with more than 40,000 respondents in total, roughly half in each of the samples. That is obviously not the standard setup. So what you will not really see in our data is coverage issues. We have respondents in every district, and that is good. Like we needed that, right? But you can still see some, say, trends and patterns that I think would generalize to strategies or like to designs where you have smaller surveys or smaller samples. So yeah, those are just like the respondent locations based on the IP address. That gives you a nice plot, but like doesn't tell you a lot because obviously those cluster where like you have where the population centers are. That is a little bit more interesting. Here I aggregate, say, like the number of respondents at the district level, at the self-reported district level, I have to say, and I plot how many respondents per 1,000 voters we have. And you see that there is a little bit of variation. Not too much, I would say, though, right? Compare that with the IP-based district location. Again, this is self-reported. Tell us your zip code, and we tell you the district that you live in, and we use that. Versus, well, we just grab your IP address, locate you, and then try to put you on a map and like sort of like overlay that on the electoral district that we care about. And you see, in terms of the district, that that is more clustered, right? And that is a consequence of how like IP geolocation works. We'll not go into the details there, but like the problem is that it comes with some imprecision and would pool some respondents to say like more central nodes where they're probably not located. And that also becomes visible when you say compare self-reported versus say IP address based location here. So I'm like, no difference between self-reported versus zip code location, both for the Bundesland, like are you in the same Bundesland when like I compare your self-report versus the zip code, or are you in the same Wahlkreis in the same district when I compare your self-report and zip code? Well, both were survey-based, so it's unsurprising that we have like an almost perfect match here. What you see is that like for at the district level, the IP, like if we take the self-reported district as ground truth, the IP address is not ideal, right? So bottom line, you might not want to use IP address based geolocations to locate people in district. It, I'm like it works half the time, right? At least in that context. When you just want to like match the state level, it works better, but also not perfectly. Okay, I have a lot of data and like I want to have some time left for Q&A, so I'll skip some of those slides. Again, like we don't have a coverage issue. Um, Say like the median number of respondents we have per district is like around 70. So that tells us something about like, yeah, we have a lot of data at the district level. And yeah, that basically tells the same, just a little bit differently. Geographic concentration, that was the second metric that I was suggesting for, say, like operationalizing geographic representativeness. Things look pretty good. And actually, they look pretty good in both samples. So what I compare here is the cumulative share of eligible voters. That is, I sort districts from like the smallest to the largest one and just then like sort the share of voters, and I do the same with the district, right? Like with the respondents. And if we had, say, like heavy clustering, say, like many of the respondents clustered in like just a few districts, we would see a curve that would deviate more heavily from the equality line here. But that's not really the case, right? So neither at the state level nor at the district level. right? We do overrepresent some of the states a little bit. You see that here compared to others, but not heavily so. Um, there's also like a map perspective on that. So does any of our samples over or underrepresent certain districts? You can see a couple of patterns here, but like they are not very strong. So like one pattern we see here is that in the axis panel, and that might just like look white on your screen, but like it's light blue, saying we have a little bit more respondents relative to say like the number of eligible voters in those districts in some of the eastern states. And the opposite is happening in like with our social media ads, right? So we were say like under recruiting people from some certain East German states and over recruiting from the Axis panel, which in the aggregate is probably nice that we have some complementarity here, but like the differences are also not that strong. Okay. I think I'll skip that. That is just like I played with some simulations, like basically trying to answer the question like how large of a sample do you need to achieve a certain coverage of districts? But A, that is probably heavily dependent on your setting, and you might not be interested in the German case at all. And second, it's a pretty, yeah, analytical technical exercise that, yeah, completely ignores, say, your ad strategy or other strategies. So I'll just skip that. Bottom line is that coverage might actually be quite straightforward to achieve. And think back to like the classic social science surveys where like coverage of all districts is just impossible. Social media, not a problem if you can afford a big enough sample. And also concentration, not much of an issue, right? And like we saw that in the map, right? Maybe some dynamics, but not a lot. And that's sort of like sets the baseline for some downstream results that I'm going to show you here. That is, are there factors at the level of our geographic unit that predicts over or under coverage? Now, you might think about that for a minute. What are your expectations? Like in which districts, or like how would a district look like where social media ad-based recruitments is easier or gives you more than in others? And we do find some interesting relationships. So what you see here is, again, like my outcome is basically that. So I have a log coverage ratio. The idea being that like values above zero means like I over recruit people from a district, and below zero I under recruit. That means the effects that we see here indicate which factors at the geographic unit level predict over recruitment versus under recruitment, right? Now, some of those variables are highly correlated, right? So look at, for instance, rurality and East Germany, for instance, right? So they're related. So when you throw everything into one model, which I do on the right-hand side, the effects look a little bit differently from what you see on the left-hand side when you just look at the bivariate correlations effectively, right? So some of the effects remain, some don't. And I just want to highlight maybe one or two things that stand out. The one is the effect that we saw on the map, right? In the axis panel, there was quite of an overrepresentation of people from East Germany. We don't have that in the social media ad sample. If anything, the opposite, but that goes away when you, say, adjust for other stuff. You would expect, in particular, like those are both online recruitment strategies, you would expect broadband coverage to matter. Turns out, yeah, maybe a little bit, but not that much. Maybe it's also a weak indicator, right? It's at the district level, and you always have, say like areas where like that coverage is higher and lower. And B, even though we talk about Germany, where this has been an issue for decades. It's not that much of an issue anymore, right? Like penetration rates are way above 95 up to 99%. So not much of variation here. Okay. I'll skip forward. Like if you want to discuss any of the other findings, happy to do so. Last section, when does geographic coverage affect estimates? And with an eye on the time, I'm happy to report that I don't have a lot of results here, so we can fast forward really. In principle, what you could expect is the following. So when you have geographic imbalance, that would translate into substantive bias if your outcome varies geographically. Like if all areas think the same, it doesn't matter. But if they do, that can become a problem. If that imbalance is systematic and not just random, and if basically you don't have a strategy to correct for it, or your strategy to correct for it doesn't work, right? If demographic post-stratification, for instance, cannot capture variation that is driven by geography, and you don't have geographic markers to correct for it, well, then you're probably doomed. So those are the problems. What I want to look into is a couple of things on the right. So when you care, for instance, about like district level outcomes, you could do MRP analyses. That is, try to estimate, for instance, latent preferences using your survey data and compare them to ground truth data. So this could be election outcomes. This could be other information that we have some ground truth data for. Comparing that through different samples and location-based recruitment strategies could be useful. Haven't done that yet. As I told you before, we have run a lot of experiments. We could, in principle, look into like to what extent treatment effects vary by experiment. Vary by geography, and to what extent that is then affected also by our recruitment strategy. Plus, there's a lot of things you can do in terms of weighting. I've tried out a bit of stuff. I have some slides in the appendix on that, but yeah, I'll just stop here, I guess. Yeah, I'll skip that. Like you see a lot of state level variation in terms of the benchmarks that I talked about. I just gave you the aggregate level benchmarks. Maybe one final thing in terms of like, does it matter? Or like, did our project work out? Those were the district level results at the last election. So the district level winners, each district colored by the party winner, basically. And this is what our two samples predicted. So we asked our citizens, which candidate, like candidate of which party do you think will win your local race? You see two things here. The first thing is both panels were in many districts were in agreement. And the second thing is that they were mostly right, right? And that despite the fact that you saw this heavy political imbalance in our sample, like we heavily over-recruited and people from certain parties, but that did not systematically lead to, say, like overestimation or underestimation of the chances of candidates of specific parties. And for the social media ads aficionados in the room, our social media panel did markedly better, actually, than the Access panel. So they forecasted 273 out of 299 districts correctly, which is better than most other, or like even all other district level forecasting models out there, including our own one that was not based on those data. So takeaways. I think it's just worth thinking about geographic representativeness, what it means, why it is relevant for you, and why you might want to care about it in addition to other, say, markers of representativeness that you already care about. Measuring is not straightforward. So like asking people specifically about like their location can actually make a lot of sense because IP geolocation is not that precise. Implementing location-based recruitment on social media is, I think, remarkably straightforward. Now, again, like I haven't run any cost-benefit analyses. I haven't seen a systematic and comprehensive effort playing around with different location-based strategies. I think like we would need that. I'd be totally interested in doing that. but the results are promising. And even our, say, like low tech approach of like just targeting the states and not the districts worked out quite nicely in giving us like good geographic coverage. Well, I'm not going to repeat like the predictors of geographic coverage, but bottom line is that, yeah, low tech approaches might work. And if you haven't thought about those, you might want to think about those. I'll stop here. Like, I don't want to bore you with like what else I want to do. I just haven't done it yet. So stay tuned. Thanks a lot for your attention, and yeah, happy to hear your feedback and answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was super fascinating, and fantastic use of kind of digging into the data more that you have collected, which of course had a different purpose, as you said, right? But it's really interesting to kind of make us think about like how to improve our samples when we recruit with social media. We have a bit of time for questions. I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to add your questions or to put them in the chat, whatever you prefer. I actually have a question for you as well, so I can just kick us off while people still mull over what you said. Kind of you talked a bit about kind of different local markets have different costs, right? So if you advertise in bigger cities, I would assume costs to be much higher. So my question is, did you manage your 64 ads that you had in some way? So for example, did you vary the ad budget depending on the cost per market? Did you do any kind of manual manipulation so that once you saw like, oh, we have actually recruited enough, kind of young females from Bavaria, so let's turn the specific ad off and so on? Or did you really just kind of you programmed it like this? But then the question is, what's the added value than doing it on the national level, right? So yeah.
Right. Right. That's a great question. I think like for the benefit of this project, we didn't play around with any budgeting decisions really because we didn't have the time. So like the project was incredibly chaotic. Like this was an early called election, and we ran out of time on multiple fronts. So the only thing we did was to say, well, actually, we want to say like cover all states more or less equally. So we set a budget. At some point, we boosted that budget, but really comprehensively and not targeting specific states. I think for those particular findings that I presented, that is good because over and under coverage is not a feature of decisions that we made during the project. It would be, of course, interesting to play around with that to learn more of like what, say, like certain budgeting decisions can buy you in terms of, as you said, right, like additional coverage in certain regions that you care about. But yeah, we didn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really sorry. Sorry, just a slight cold there. I think that probably we tried that in one of our projects in Burkina Faso, where we tried to get kind of more balanced geographic coverage, which is a country that has low, internet penetration and coverage. And so we wanted to avoid that, we just get basically respondents from the capital. And we did play a bit kind of to mimic a bit, I think, what the commercial panels are doing, to kind of take the grid of targeted populations, both based on demographics and geography, and then kind of once a cell is filled to stop recruiting that particular group. It was tricky. I mean, we did get a more balanced panel this way, or like sample, but it is definitely kind of also tricky to kind of keep track, right, of 64 different ads. That's kind of part of the problem. But I think that might be also a way forward to make these, because I think you made a very convincing case of why we should care about geography. I totally buy that, but I think we can do even more to get a more balanced sample with this particular approach.
I
Okay, are there
agree. And
any?
maybe just like as one
Yeah,
follow-up, like we did do something like at the country level, right? Like as you did as well, like we ran multi-country studies in other contexts and there, like we had to like react heavily because like recruitment was just like not working out as well as we thought in some countries versus others. So and also like sub-demographic groups. We didn't do like sub-national, say like location targeting, but it was a mix of like country and demographic targeting. Yeah, and I think you have to do that.
Okay. Any more questions? If I mean we're please feel free to also speak up. If you have a question, just raise your hands and I can unmute you so you can ask your question to Simon. No? Maybe I just have a question about kind of the IP address, which is really interesting that it worked so badly. So, do you have any explanation of this? Is that because ultimately, people move around too much, or because that was always like it seemed like such a straightforward way, right, to locate people.
Yeah, I don't think I have a good answer here. Like here, like I tried to assemble a couple of like evidence. Like we were not the first to look into like IP-based geolocation. There are people who do that professionally. And like a consistent finding, obviously, is that like the higher you go, say like at the country level, and say, like at the regional, like nuts 2 level, that stuff is fairly precise. The further you go down, the more problematic things become. I'm just not like I'm not a an engineer in that context to know what exactly would go on. What I would want to look into is I'm like we have information about like device type. So apparently mobile IP addresses are harder to localize based on how yeah IP address assignment works when you basically walk around with your phone. We have that data, so that is something I want to like cross-check whether things are straightforward if people basically answer stuff at on their desktop versus on their mobile device. So that is something to I want to look into. You can also, I'm like, there is like a big difference in terms of like Wahlkreis, like district size, right? You have the very small, like geographically small urban districts, and the big but sparsely populated rural districts. I would guess that there is a relationship as well, but yeah, haven't looked into that yet.
No, I mean, thanks so much. I think that maybe the lesson then learned is we need to include something that asks, a zip code or anything to kind of get a better sense of where people actually are.
Yeah,
Um, okay, if there are no more questions from the attendees, I would say, yeah, I hope that you write up this paper. I think it's really interesting to compare different ways of, doing these data collections and recruiting people online, and kind of seeing, how things are, vary between the two different samples. I think there's really interesting, results here. So thanks so much for sharing this with us and showing us, first insights into this. Um, this concludes our spring sessions of our webinar series. But we, as always, we of course want to continue the series. So if anyone, wants to present their work, please get in touch with us. Otherwise, you hear from us with new sessions being scheduled then in the autumn. Simon, thanks so much for your time and good luck
thanks
with
for
this
having me.
project.
Thank you.